Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Sid Shami. One more episode, Legacy and Impact. If you are a business owner, a commercial real estate owner, investor, if you want to learn, people like me, people like Ali, who's my guest, a chief guest, I want to say, born entrepreneur, have made success, mistakes, learning like everyone like us. And today, Ali is going to share what he have learned and how he is conducting his business. The show is about legacy and impact. That's what I dream every single day. What am I going to leave behind when I go away? And what am I impact I'm creating when I'm here? If you are somebody who resonates with this message, you definitely want to listen to this. Ali, without any delay, you and I have been chatting backstage. I immediately heard your story and, came across with this singular voice word. You're a born entrepreneur. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us our audience why they should listen to us.
Well, Sid, thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited, and because this is a special treat, and I'll tell you why. I didn't expect to bond on so many different levels with you,
Yeah,
having just recently met, right? So we have
yeah,
a history of our ancestral background. We have a commonality with Houston, and of course, our love and passion for what we do every day in commercial real estate and generational wealth building and
awesome.
whatnot. So I'm really excited. It's a simple story. Probably like many other immigrant stories, we arrived here in the early '70s. What makes us unique is that I'm blessed to be eighth generation in commercial real estate that I've been
Yeah,
able to trace, maybe even more, but at least
yeah,
eight generations back. And as we were talking briefly about earlier, what didn't transfer is capital or liquidity in those generations because of
yeah,
wars and partitions and migrations and all of those things. But what does transfer and has transferred, and the blessing has been, is the tenacity, the ambition, the knowledge, basic
yeah.
principles of business and real estate. And my father was a sponge, and thankfully, and then I was able to be a sponge around him, and it's just been that kind of instill what's been instilled. And I think, Sid, you bring up a good point. Like it never crossed my mind, the notion or the idea of being able to go work for somebody. And I'm not saying that's better or worse, but that
Yeah,
was just instilled from day one. So for better or for worse, and there's been some times where it's been a rough road, right? Because
yeah,
as you may know from our culture, which is very common, I think, in other places too, my father said, "Hey, I'm not going to give you any fish. I'll
absolutely.
teach you how to fish."
Yeah,
But and so
you gotta do
so
your job.
yeah, and rightfully so. And he did that. And so at 17, I was out doing deals and experienced a number of different asset classes along the way and within real estate. Also did some Main Street distressed businesses. You talk about failures. I've had plenty of mine, in those in different places. And but what's one thing that has remained steady since essentially the last Iran war crisis is our investment in the manufactured housing space for
Mhm.
45 years now. In fact, last month marks our 45th year anniversary.
Wow. Yeah,
So anyway,
awesome.
yeah.
Hey, I was chatting with you a little bit before this session. You mentioned that you basically have done all kinds of jobs, odd jobs, all the way to what you're doing today. I want you to tell us a little bit more about that. But before you do that, you mentioned, the capital was never transferred, the wealth was transferred. More like the legacy was transferred, right? So your family, and just like my family as well, we migrated three times between three different countries. You probably migrated four times because you went to England as well. And those who have not gone through the experience have no idea how you lose your wealth and capital when you migrate, right, from one country to another. So give us a little bit more color on that, and also things that you have done that built up to you to come to this level with manufactured housing investments.
Yeah. So I think the at least in my lifetime, of course, the wars and the partitions were very difficult, where we left the gold bars that were in storage and the lands, ancestral lands, all that behind long ago. But that was before. That didn't directly impact me. What impacted me is my father's migrations, and as you are rightfully alluding to, when you're into, there's just so many facets, and for someone to start over in a foreign land and foreign language and foreign business environment, he had a lot of falls along the way, but
Yeah.
he never gave up. I grew up as a result of the Iran war crisis in the late '70s, and I'm dating myself.
Yeah.
Um, by '81, I was 12 years old. And long story short, my father had a portfolio of 120 homes in Orange County in the late '70s that he had developed or acquired from nothing. So they were highly leveraged, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and and when the Iran war crisis happened back then, they came down like a house of cards, all of it,
Mm,
because it was so highly leveraged. And he was able to salvage enough liquidity to put a down payment on his first manufactured housing community, or really an RV park at that time. And so I went from living in a McMansion in Orange County, California,
mm,
to living in a trailer park in a trailer,
mm.
at 12 years age. And that's the environment that I grew up in, is like, I'm living in this trailer park and we've got to work as a family. We've got to work really hard to rebuild.
Yeah.
And, and I think that was probably the greatest blessing in my life, Sid.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was working day to day. It wasn't about football. It wasn't about the activities or anything else.
Yeah.
It wasn't any of that,
Cards.
right? I was having fun,
Yeah.
just learning and being a sponge and working the business. And so before you know it, by 16, I'm buying and selling homes, and by 17, 18, I'm buying and selling real property. Homes,
Awesome.
I mean manufactured homes. And
Yes. Yes.
so in any case, so that's the background. I did do a couple of jobs. I've never really kept a job. I don't think I'm employable. I don't think it's just something that's been, I think, naturally instilled. But what I did do, frankly, and selfishly, may add, is I went to work to learn a few things. So
Yeah.
whether it was in sales, also I went and became an appraiser. Obviously, not for the money,
Mm.
but I became an
To
appraiser
learn. Yeah.
to learn and to make
Yeah.
sure I understood the fundamentals of underwriting well. It's particularly my space. So I was the mobile home park appraiser guy,
Wow.
back in the day. That's like 96. So anyway, things of that sort. I did that early on. I worked for Dale Carnegie Training for a few months, or
Yeah.
maybe
You told
six
me that.
months,
Yeah.
while going through university. But that was because I'm such a big fan, of course, of the principles, and that's
Yeah.
another golden, I think, side nugget that every audience member should take
Yeah.
in. But in any case, most of my life has been on this entrepreneurial journey, including success and
Yeah.
failures.
Yeah. I think you said something that I always internally talk with my team. If you are a good entrepreneur, you're a really bad employee because you're running so fast that your employer cannot keep up. A lot of people are good entrepreneurs because they run with their own speed and they can do a lot of great things within the organization. So if you know who you are, that's the first blessing that you can get. And something you mentioned which resonates with me as well. You said you're living in a mansion and it's a cosine graph that we live our life that teaches humbleness, right? One of the things that happened to me was it's a fun fact that I tell some of my team members that if I can do it, you can do it, right? If you're working for me, it doesn't matter to me. You're working for yourself, right? And I today I own one apartment complex where I used to rent a unit. And when I tell the story to my to my on-site managers, like, oh my God, this it was a C-class property, and I was just barely making to the college and trying to get to it. So like you said, we connect on several levels. I want
What
to,
a fantastic! I gotta just stop there for a moment. What a
yeah.
fantastic story there. To go full cycle. What a great experience for you, and how inspiring that is for your property manager there.
I lived there in 2011. Bought the property in 2018. I
Okay.
was in 8 years. you know, I was on a right path. I feel like, when I was doing my oil and gas career job, I was buying single family houses, work or rental houses. That's all I was doing. But initially, to be honest, I was not sure how this journey of mine would translate into the culture where we're in today. Back home, people would look down upon us like, oh, how did you come up with this? In fact, back home, you probably would agree to it. If you don't have a real job, people say you're a fraud.
Right. Right.
I
Yeah.
don't know what you're doing. You don't have a job. What do you do again?
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's
And there was no respect for real estate at all. That
always
wasn't considered. And so now all of a sudden, I think things are changing there too. But
yeah,
I
yeah.
I completely get it.
You mentioned something about in our conversation. You had a medieval type grand bazaar that you guys used to own. My father used to have the same ownership in those kind of real estate. So that one of the things that reminded me was like, oh my God, this is real. Where are we going with that?
Right.
Tell me, Ali, how many years you said it's 45 years that you guys into manufactured housing?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Where do you own it? How much do you own it? Tell us all about it. How are you guys managing it?
So, we've historically, as a family office, we've always been in California for that 45 years, and all up and down the state, really up and down. Your audience must have some idea about the state. And so Highway 99, I-5 corridors, you name
Okay.
it, small towns, tertiary markets, secondary markets, even somewhat primary markets. We've done it all. Today, it's hard to compete in the primary markets, of course, with the big REITs
Yeah.
and private equity groups. And we typically were not holding most of the time. We were acquiring distress, stabilizing, and then exiting. So we kept
Okay.
rolling up. rolling up through the 1031, and we started really, frankly, with small communities in tertiary markets, and we kind of gradually over the decades, but all private, own capital and some debt, no equity from outside equity.
It's a great, that's huge, right? And you guys were able to do it all through 1031. That's in itself, the 40 years of work shows what a foundation. Are you guys still owning any of these assets? How much are those, and what's your management style?
Yeah, so I should clarify. So today I have Rise 360 Ventures, which we founded because the family is ready to retire. Everybody's
Mm.
fat and happy, right? So they're done, but I'm not done, and I want to keep going in this particular asset class. So what I've done is basically, the family office is essentially stabilized, and maybe we'll even exit. And Rise
Mhm.
360 Ventures is set up to help passive investors now with my
Got
45
it.
years experience who don't want to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, we still have our portfolio. It's on autopilot with our internal, management company. And at some point, there may be a formal exit, but there's really not a lot of hands-on. For Rise 360, we have the same thing that I did with the family office, which is 100 plus units, secondary market, value add play, and it
Got it.
doesn't have
Yeah.
to be in California. It could be anywhere, wherever the deal makes sense. But that said, and again, a tip, and I'm sure you would agree with this as well, I'm very biased to doing deals that I can like physically get to, I can drive to. So even if it's a 4 hour drive versus a 4 hour flight, or even a 3 hour flight, the deal is exactly the same. I'm gonna pick the 4 hour drive
Right.
only,
Yeah.
right? Because even you saw who knew that in the pandemic it would be even
The COVID.
difficult.
Yes. Yes.
Right,
Yes. Yes.
right.
Absolutely.
So
And then tell us a little bit more about this asset class. I've seen quite a few institution, private money, private capital. They're flooding this market. What do you see from that perspective, and how are you combating it?
and so let's start with first. I'm not combating it. I'm not. I don't see it as something to fight or
Not a
combat.
not a competition. Okay.
Yeah, and most people do. Most
Mm.
people in our audience, most people in our market would be like, "Oh my God, we're getting saturated. We're getting overwhelmed by everybody
Yeah.
else," and that's a fair argument. But I've lived through where I had to be the transporter, I had to be the installer, I had to be the lender to the home
Yeah.
buyer.
Yeah.
I had to play it all because there was no. And then when you buy a community, it was all seller financing, right?
Yeah.
We weren't an industry, we weren't an asset class,
Correct.
and and so the improvement of the quality of the home, and we could talk about that if you'd like it also, and kind of the reduction of the stigma that we've
Hmm.
had for decades. It's
Hmm.
not gone, but it's better. But and the fact that other asset classes have become so saturated has created this frenzy. We
Yeah.
went from being trailer trash and slumlords to suddenly being the darling asset class. And it's been a big change. I felt like the girl who nobody wanted to dance with, on the dance floor, to suddenly being the sexiest,
Yeah.
girl on the floor.
Yeah.
And it's been quite a journey, and that's only happened, I would say, really in the last 10, 15 years, right? Out of those
Yeah.
45 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's a good thing, Sid. And I think one thing that's really fascinating about our space, I could just go on for hours, and maybe about what makes this asset class so unique and so much, frankly, with all due respect, obviously I'm biased, but so much better than any other in terms of risk, in terms of tenant retention, upside, value add,
Yeah.
all of those things by
Yeah.
far, by far, right? And so there's I think this frenzy that you're seeing that you brought up is it's warranted,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
Yeah,
Correct. Especially when Wall Street money is chasing, or Main Street money is chasing an asset class, that means it's doing good. Right.
right,
That's a
right.
great point.
You asked about this earlier. I wanted to also just say this is not coming from someone who's had blindfolds on and been
Yeah.
limited or exclusive to
Yeah.
one asset class,
Guys doing
right?
it. That speaks
No,
for yeah.
well, no, what I meant is that I've done other asset classes, right? I've
I
done
see.
other businesses. And
Yes.
so I've done parking, I've done strip centers, shopping centers, we have done hotels, motels, certainly understand multifamily, and so it's not just that I've got my horse blinders on just because I've done this for 45 years.
Correct.
I'm speaking to you having experience in those other asset classes and saying, thankfully, and in hindsight, looking
Yeah.
back, saying, "Wow, this has really been the best platform."
Yeah, yeah. And then when you're managing these assets, you said you're managing it internally. Roughly speaking, what's your employee size look like? What's your management style? What's your leadership style looks like? And how are these people working under you are making things happen while you and I are sitting here chatting?
Right. So the Rice 360 Ventures team is a relatively new entity, new brand. Although, so we acquired one small property to kind of get going initially just a couple years back, and we're actually formally launching one of our bigger funds later in the month. But to answer your question, we're about 20 people now,
Uh,
and in terms of how I operate or how we operate, they feel empowered. Hopefully, that I'm not micromanaging, and that's the whole goal, right? Is to be able to give. They're essentially working for themselves as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
So that's what we're doing there. We're about 20 people there, and we also have so my family office, which is still really operating the communities, the larger community, that's another 20 or 25 people on the ground, boots on the ground. And who knows, at some point, when those assets are sold, maybe it would be Rice 360 or others that would acquire those. So
Go ahead.
I would
Yeah.
say combined, we're about 40, 50 people.
Yeah. So 40, 50. So that's a big operation, right? That's something that a lot of people cannot understand that what it takes to get there, right? It's I always internally speak from the things like it takes a lot of good people to make a good company. You cannot have just one good and rest of them are underperformers, or you're the only smartest guy in the company. That means you don't have a company. You just have a bunch of sheep's herding, right?
Right.
The I want to ask you something. This asset class that you're working right now, give us a little bit more of a nut bolt in terms of when you're buying, what kind of returns are you targeting? I know quite a bit of operations and goods and bads both, but from your perspective, what are things that you like? What are things you do not like? I mean, I would love to share both, right? Hey, this is what I love doing this in this asset class, and this is something I'm not a fan of in some ways.
Sure, sure. So first of all, like as I mentioned, I think earlier, you want to see at least 50 units. I prefer 100, but you want to see at least 50 units to have the economies of scale and to be able to hedge your risk properly over a number of tenants. I'd like to avoid, underground utilities that are private. So I prefer municipalities,
Yeah,
the
the
city
mud. Yeah,
waters,
yeah.
right?
Okay.
So that's a big concern, especially in older parks, and most of them are old. So that's a big, risk. You better really do your homework and due diligence about that. Not to say I won't do it, but it's got to be factored in,
Yeah, correct. The price has to
economically.
be right for that. Yeah.
Right. The other big pitfall, I think, is a big mistake, and this is I see lenders, appraisers, even brokers making this mistake, certainly buyers and newbie buyers,
Mm,
which is, if you find a park or a community, and I like to call them communities, so we're trying to transition to manufactured
absolutely.
housing
Yeah.
communities. If you find a community that has a lot of community owned homes, that's okay. That's okay. You still value and look at the deal, but understand that if the price, the value that's being placed, the asset value that's being placed on that includes the income of those homes, that is a faux pas. That is
Correct.
a major no-no. And
Correct. Correct.
people,
Correct.
because now you're valuing real estate, real dirt,
Hmm.
real property with metrics of personal property. Those homes are considered personal property because they're not fee simple. They're not owned. The ownership is not by the same person that owns the land underneath.
Correct. 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 Correct.
And so that's personal property like a car, which
Yeah.
historically, typically should depreciate,
Yeah.
right? And but when you start skewing that income, you start mixing that income, now you really, and historically, you would become unbankable. I think agency lenders now accept many of them accept up to 20% park owned. They call it park owned homes. But as a buyer, beware, because if that income is baked in and into the valuation, you are overpaying. You need to
Hmm.
carve that out. Sure,
Yeah. You
it
need
has
to take those houses out and play for the spots.
the actual yes, that the value of those homes and the income stream from those homes, and
Correct.
there is a value to that. I'm not saying don't pay for it, and I would personally don't want, with the general model, as you may know, but for your audience, the conventional model of this asset class is that communities don't typically own the
The
homes in
homes.
them.
Yes. Yes.
We
Yes.
just own the dirt.
What's your strategy look like when there's an eviction and you hold on to the house or to the warehouse?
So eviction, rent control, fortunately or unfortunately, really unfortunately, frankly, from an investor mindset,
Hmm.
we have all the same challenges as you do in multifamily.
Correct.
So we still have to go through the same eviction process. We still deal with rent control, and but that's for the lot, not for But the good news is, first of all, we don't face it as much as you do, by dramatically less, only because the home is owned by the tenant.
Correct.
And
They don't wanna pay for a lot, small price and lose $5,000 or $10,000 of house.
or more, right? Who
Yeah.
wants to give up $100,000 house in by defaulting on a $500 or $1,000 lot
Right.
rent? It only happens if somebody passes away or something devastating, God forbid. So our tenant retention is oftentimes for a lifetime, literally, because
Mhm.
they own their home.
Correct. Correct.
And if not, it's usually very long. But even if there is a default, our bad debt is, I would say, somewhere around, dare I say, like maybe officially 3%, but in reality, 0.
Mm.
Because to your point, what you said earlier, ultimately you put a lien on the home and you recoup your funds.
Correct. 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 Yeah. The home that they leave behind will probably easily cover the 7 months of rent that they're not gonna pay. No, absolutely. Ali, I want to change a topic a little bit. Being an entrepreneur and the legacy that you're creating for your upcoming generation, or the one that you know inherited, I can clearly see the impact that you're creating is really providing clean, functional housing to the audience who may not have that opportunity. Right? This is the impact that you're creating. My question to you is, if you had to go back 10, 15, 20 years and you have to change a few things to, I don't know, be a better version of Ali. I don't know. You already I'm not I'm not exaggerating, but you're already where a lot of people would dream to be. But what are the things that you would change to, 10 years ago, mistakes that you may have not done it, or in hindsight speaking, what would you do differently to be a better version of Ali today, in a context that somebody who's listening to you may impact a positive impact in their life?
I'll go 2 dimensions on this. Personally and spiritually, let me bring that dimension in also, because I think it's helpful, and it really answers your question. I think I should have listened more to my own gut, my instincts,
Mm,
my intuition, right? And I did at times, but I second guessed myself at times also because of hearsay and listening to other parties. So
yeah,
I'd say, you know,
we all do.
that
We all do. Yeah.
right. And looking back, I'm thinking, "Oh my god, I was right. I should have just stuck with what I was thinking, and I shouldn't have let those things get to me." So, if you're
True.
in that position, listening, take that spiritually. Now, going back to the actual business, I have to say, I failed on a lot of high risk Main Street type ventures. I failed in some risky deals, which I don't regret on the real property side, because those were also those were learning experiences. But in hindsight, to answer your question, if I had focused more on my own asset class, I probably would have
Mm.
scaled even faster and wider. And so I don't know if it's a regret, but that's probably what I would have done different, knowing what I know now.
I love the fact that how you kept it real, right? Listening to your own gut, I always say, you know your organs more than anybody else, right? The doctor knows it second, you know it first. If your organ telling you that this is not the right move, you'd probably be right, and that's really the gut move. The second thing I say is, what you mentioned is inch wide, mile deep, right? Already know what you're doing, it's better to keep doing that. Obviously, keep an eye out on what's happening, what's changing. But if you're keeping the same lane, I mean, we hardly move, not because we can't, but it's just one of those things that make more than one degree angle change from our direction. And if anytime I've done that pivot or that move, it's always waste of time, right? So there's always going to be a case where you will be leaving money on the table. It's always be the case, right?
Sure.
So either you leave it by realizing it, or you lose it by not realizing it.
Right.
So,
Right.
so this is a great advice. I want to say, anybody who's listening or watching this, listen to your gut feeling, like Ali said. Do better what you know versus experimenting new things without researching. Right. I think that's essentially what you're saying.
That's right. And at least listen to it, right? People like you ignore intuition. I'm not saying that you're always going to be right, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't apply common sense and logic or whatnot, but don't ignore it.
Yeah.
Give value to that.
Yeah. Better to double question somebody else versus you yourself.
Right.
One of the things that I tell myself, I know when I have to double check my intuition. And that's one litmus test only. I'm going to ask myself, am I been working hard enough for last few months or not? If I'm not working hard enough, I'm just chilling out, I'm going to work hard again and go back and check on my intuition. That's usually the case that happens to me when I'm just, high flying and not paying too much attention. That's where my gut feeling, goes wrong if I'm listening.
Sure. If I may, I also want to tie it back to, I think, the first part of your question or comment, Sid, which is, look, we're living in crazy times, geopolitical issues, macroeconomic issues, domestic issues that are making it more and more almost like where we come from originally, where our ancestry comes from, where you're seeing the middle class kind of shrinking, right?
Yeah,
And it's more of the have and have nots, and it's becoming more and more difficult for many people to enjoy the American dream, which is what the reason we've come here, we've migrated
correct.
here.
Correct.
And
Yeah,
so, and in this beautiful country where you have that upward mobility, the possibility of that, right?
absolutely.
And so what I'm getting to is that as affordable housing becomes more and more difficult, and that term is thrown around so nonchalantly and
Yeah,
loosely, everybody says, "Oh, we need it, we want it, we're going to do this," but manufactured housing communities are an integral part of the solution.
yeah,
Right? We
yeah.
are the solution. We're the last stop for the American dream. If you want to own a home, like for example, let me just give where I live in Silicon Valley. You have these techies earning lots of money, but still can't afford a home in Silicon Valley,
Yeah.
right? They'd have to drive an hour or 2 hours.
Hour and a half or 2 hour. Yeah, yeah.
And that's the IT folks. What about everybody else who earns far less than them,
Right.
doing some of the other jobs, right? And but some of these folks have figured out, hey, I can live in this manufactured housing community that's right here for a fraction of the regular home, and I don't have to commute 2 hours. So we're seeing Gen Z and millennials adopt this.
Going in there. Yeah.
Right, and maybe that's not the most compelling example, but I would argue that we are the solution for affordable housing nationwide for all different types of income streams. And we just haven't had our fair due. And now this housing crisis, what do they say? We're at least 4 million units short,
Yes.
and
Yes.
and some people would argue it's double that. And so we this is our moment to shine. And
Correct.
and
Correct.
we just need to get the word out. So I appreciate you giving us time.
No, absolutely. I think, you know, people have to live somewhere. And the way economy and the top waterfall jug is being depleting, it's going to impact the whole down in the in those buckets. The impact that we as an owner operators creating for housing is, yes, it's investment driven, but it is one of those impact that we're creating, especially, manufactured housing, mobile home park, B and C apartment complexes, even A. Most Gen Zs do not want to buy a house anymore.
Right.
They wanna live a place where it's closer to their work and they don't have the hassle to manage any of that, like you mentioned. And then a lot of people are won't be able to afford it anymore. They won't be able to afford B and C products, and they'll be moving into a mobile home park. The high earner incomes are also reducing their commute. So my story for coming into apartment complex, I was living in an apartment complex, B apartment complex, working for oil and gas, trying to save money, bought a bunch of houses. And then I forgot all about apartments, how to live in an apartment because I moved into one of my rent houses. And I think few years later, when I was investing with somebody, I was a passive investor, and went to his property and I met with a leasing agent or the on-site staff and asked the leasing
Yes.
agent, hey, oh, do you live here? And I was assuming, right, that obviously you should be living here. And she's like, oh, I can't afford it. And that really struck me hard. It's like, so this person that works here and she cannot afford the rent here, right? This is what drives you in the back of your mind. But obviously, I always say, funds first, culture later, right? If you don't have funds, you cannot make anybody happy. And that's where I realized, like, if you really want to make an impact, if I wouldn't have been laid off, I may not have been doing that. But when I did, I was like, if I want to do that, I want to do what I heard a few years ago from that leasing agent. So that's why I'm into medical and multifamily. And we own about 35 apartment communities, and we have not lost any of those in this troubling times. We have some troubled times from our cash flow and distribution perspective, but it's terrible to say that we can stand tall while most of our competition can't, or most of people who have been doing it for XYZ reasons. I think the affordable housing is l- good or bad, but it's going to be the cornerstone of coming years. It's not going away anytime soon, and it's cycle changes, but what you're doing and what we're doing is going to be the first need. Your rent is your first expense of the month. That's not going
Right.
away.
Everybody needs a place. Everyone needs a roof, right? And and you mentioned a couple times how your A, B, and C, your apartments are multifamilies rated by class, and our communities are rated by a star system. So one
Mm.
being the least compelling or
Yeah,
least attractive with curb appeal,
yeah,
but not,
yeah,
and 5 star, which is the point I'm trying to make. I think the notion that everybody, the manufactured housing community is the last resort. is that I also want that fallacy to go away.
Yeah, yeah.
We have a community in San Diego, for example, with 8 man-made lakes and tennis courts and bocce courts, and it's a country club type feel. It's a gated
Right.
community. Many people have it's for them, it's their second home. So people, it's a lifestyle choice. It's an economic choice sometimes,
Correct.
right? So it's not always just this sheer necessity
Correct.
and and
Correct.
and whatnot. But I think it's important to say that, yeah, like you're saying, I think that we are, yes, we are the most affordable solution. It's not something that's forced on people. I think people are finally realizing that these are thriving communities,
Correct.
is what the
Correct.
point I'm
Correct.
trying to
Correct.
make.
No, especially I think in Texas, people are moving towards those kind of housing more so because those housing do not have a property tax because they're, especially if they're on not on the land, if it's on the pier, it's movable. So you're right, there are different stars, different level of those manufactured housing. Some will be extremely affordable because that's how they're built, and some will be nicer and more like, I call it dream communities, where you basically go spend a vacation there.
Right. Right.
Awesome. Awesome. Ali, I truly appreciate the time. Last advice you want to give it to anybody who's looking to start into real estate, start into what you're doing. What would be the first few things that you would tell them to do?
It all depends, of course, on one's resources. But assuming the worst case, if you have very limited resources and very limited knowledge, let's say you don't have the capital to get started, I would say, two or three things. One, get out there, meet people who are doing it, get out there and learn from actual people who are actually, doing it in your community. Attend the meetups, for example, or the masterminds to do that. Secondly, if you can't invest yourself directly, then help others invest. By that I mean, get involved in maybe in an intermediary role, maybe a sales role or a consultant role where you can actually, and whatever level you have to start at, to get that exposure, because you're not necessarily doing it all just for the income. You're doing it for the knowledge. You're doing it and it will be transactional at first, but you're going to get that exposure and you're going to build your network. And then while you're doing that, as you said, you've got to have the hustle. So while you're doing that, as you're doing it, you keep your eyes and ears open for a creative deal. More and for those who are just getting in, great news for you. Because, and I say this selfishly from an investor's mindset and not a consumer. I'm not happy that we're going to be paying $17 for a latte in the next, probably pretty soon. I'm not happy about that. But the great news is, from an investor mindset, there's going to be an abundance, I think, of deals that offer creative financing.
Yes.
So don't let the fact that you don't have capital be the excuse. Learn the game, get yourself around people, take some action by putting disrespectful offers out there, strike a deal, and then if it is the right deal, and I know people will counter this a lot to say, if the deal makes sense, the money will come. And I get a lot of pushback from that. Well, Ali, that doesn't always happen. Sure, it doesn't always happen. But if the deal makes sense, and if you're hustling, keep going. It's a numbers game. You just got to get out there. So hopefully that helps.
Awesome. No, absolutely. I think what you're essentially saying is you got to brute force your way. If you're behind on the game of resources, which is not your fault, but you cannot be behind on the game of brute force, right? You got to brute force your way all the way and go everywhere. I joke around sometimes, like if you're going for a battle, the last thing should be in your mind is how you're going to look like when you're riding a horse. That should not be your problem. Your problem is, are you going to win that battle?
Are you going to win the
And
battle?
that's exactly what you have to. You got to meet everybody you can, ask as many questions as you can. There are 7 billion or more people in the world. And all you have to do is find a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction group of people who like you, trust you, and want to work with you. I completely disagree with one of the people say all the time, it's like you fake it until you make it. Well, if you fake it in front of the right person, that person will identify it. So better not to fake it, be yourself, and stay consistent. The mentors the person that you're looking for, who's going to help, who's going to shake your hand and give you the first deal, is the one who is the real person, who's not looking for a faker, who is actually looking for somebody who is consistent and deliver the things that you say you're going to deliver. So that being said, Ali, it was great talking.
That was so well said. That was so well said, Sid. I mean, that's probably the greatest advice through this entire podcast.
We gave the same message in our own style, and hopefully somebody who's confused into a W-2 that they don't like. I'm not against W-2. Let me just clarify. If that's your only source of income, you should not bitch about that. Do your job, earn the earning for your family, but at the same time, try to see what you are making the living. How are you going to make make your legacy. That's the whole point.
I'm going to add one more piece. I know we're running
Yes.
out of time, Sid. When you asked the question about what someone should do to get started, I gave you the mechanical steps, and then
Correct.
I want to bring the spiritual side back
Yes.
to it with a little side story as we close. When I was 13 or 14 years old, my father would have weekly meetings with us. Every Friday, he would take us for ice cream, the kids, and he would ask us, give us a chance to say whatever was on our mind, good or bad. And one time he asked, what do you want to do when you grow up? And all my siblings answered with their career of choice, doctor, engineer, lawyer, whatever, professional.
Yeah.
And
That's a typical Brown answer.
yeah, and maybe it was business or whatever, but
Yeah.
I gave a different answer, and I going back to what we talked about earlier, I kind of second guessed myself for some years, but in hindsight, I realized that my answer back then was exactly the right path, and my answer was, I just want to love and be loved.
Beautiful.
So,
Yes.
so I think that has to be incorporated. If you're
Absolutely.
doing it just for the money, if you're
Yeah.
chasing the dollar, that's just ultimately not going. If you're faking it till you make it, all that stuff is not gonna. You got to be authentic. You got to be real. You got to be contributing, and you got to be trying to do the best. I would say let's not forget the human element
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. That's what we learned over years. Love, be love, and be loved. Yeah. That's awesome.
That's it.
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, I'm just gonna conclude. Usually we go for 30 minutes, but I love talking to you, and we're closing for an hour mark here.
Oh,
Ali,
wow.
thanks for your time. If somebody wants to reach out to you, I believe they can go to
Rice360ventures.com. You'll get a free, a complimentary 80-page detailed report about the asset class. So there's all that stuff that we couldn't cover in this podcast. If they want to get more information, they can get all about that. And you can also, of course, find us on social media just about everywhere.
Awesome.
LinkedIn,
All right.
LinkedIn,
Cool.
and everywhere.
Thanks, Ali. I would love to chat a little bit more with you, but hopefully I would love to have you again on our podcast.
Let's do it anytime.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Sid. Thank you very much.